The A7S III is a dream camera for most people, but it's been out for a while and might not live up to the hype. In this video, I'm going to push the A7S III to its absolute limit to see how it compares to the newer and better cameras coming out, testing everything from 4K 120 to incredible low light at 100,000 ISO, including shooting an actual project with it to see how it does in the real world. And if you're new to the channel, my name is River and we talk about anything and everything to do with camera gear, including teaching you guys how to use your camera gear to its full potential. And if you want the best pricing on any of the gear that we talk about today, make sure to check out the links in the description down below. Alright guys, let's figure out just how good the A7S III is by shooting some epic footage with it. And most of you guys watching this probably shoot weddings, interviews, music videos, commercials, or short films. So I made sure to test this camera out for those exact scenarios. And at the very end, we're going to shoot an actual project with the A7S III. The first thing that I wanted to test with this camera are the three most important features in any camera. These features determine if your camera looks cinematic or professional, and that's dynamic range, colors, and frame rates. As for dynamic range, I wanted to test this camera out in a variety of situations to see exactly how far I could push the image. In terms of dynamic range, it has about 13 stops, which is about 3 stops less than the gold standard of a RED camera or an RE Alexa. For reference, I shot most of my footage in S-Log3 at base ISO of 640 and 12,800 with 2 stops overexposed. Sony recommends overexposing this camera for the best results. When shooting in bright outdoor conditions, I found the highlight roll-off to be beautiful. The A7S III handles highlights super well. I cannot think of a single instance where the highlights clipped. They sort of just fade off into white, sort of like an Alexa. And this is even with overexposing by 2 stops. However, needing to overexpose by 2 stops in S-Log3 actually becomes a huge flaw in this camera. I'll talk about this later on in the video where it makes more sense. And in low light or evening conditions, there's still plenty of midtone and shadow details. Basically zero noise when shooting close to base ISO 640 or 12,800 in my case. The sensor can pick up plenty of image information even in the dimmest of conditions. And speaking of low light, wow. Just wow. I was able to shoot right out of a plane window at 64,000 ISO in pitch black and still get a very good looking image. I found 64,000 ISO is the upper limit for professional use. 100,000 ISO is pretty grainy, but it's still insane that this camera does 100,000 ISO. And a lot of this is actually because of the incredible sensor design in the A7S III. Alright, so we might as well talk about the elephant in the room. The A7S III has a 12 megapixel full frame sensor. I promise you it's not low resolution for video. Most cameras actually line skip and don't use the full sensor, so the 4K from the A7S III looks just as sharp and detailed as you would from a competing camera like the Canon R5 or any other Sony camera. And the low megapixel count actually improves slow motion and rolling shutter. The A7S III can do 4K at 120 frames per second in 10-bit 422 with 0 rolling shutter in any mode. The A7S does not crop, it does not reduce quality or color data because it has less megapixels to read out. This is a controversial thing to say, but I actually think the 12 megapixel sensor is the strength of the Sony A7S. Lastly, let's talk about the most important image test for any camera. And that's colors. And the A7S III is actually supposed to have the brand new color science from Sony's cinema line of cameras. It's not that good. This camera actually doesn't have those same refined colors that you would find in an FX6 or a Sony Venice. On paper, it's the same color science, but it's not. The skin tones in the A7S III still have a yellow and magenta pollution, and they still look kind of dull. And large patches of blue and green look oversaturated and have a really odd plastic feel to them. On any other camera, this would be an absolute deal breaker. But it's pretty easy to forgive on the A7S III for 2 main reasons. It has 10-bit color at 422, which is becoming more common in mid-tier cameras. But it also has the XAVC codec, which is unique to Sony. Now, 10-bit color at 422 will get you pretty close to the color precision that you can get from a professional cinema camera. Now, this gives you the ability to easily correct any sort of skin tone issue, but what's really exciting is that this level of color allows you to create a really dense and cinematic look. And the XAVC codec can record up to 600 megabits per second, which is an absolutely insane amount of data. It makes your video files extremely resilient to color artifacting or macro blocking when you're applying a color grade or heavily adjusting the exposure. Although, I should mention, the A7S III has pretty beefy files. You're going to need a good computer. I have an RTX 2080 Super and I still had pretty long render times. I recommend using XAVC and leaving XAVC HS, which is the high compression one, just out of it. It's super high compression and you need a really strong processor to unpack those files without making proxies. And I know everyone says the A7S III is bad for photos, but this level of flexibility in colors and dynamic range actually does carry over to the photo sides. And in my testing, I got some pretty decent results, although 12 megapixels is probably still too low res for most shooters. So at the end of the day, the A7S III has a great image. It's definitely not on the same level as a Red camera or even an Arri Alexa, but I'd say it's pretty close to a mid-tier cinema camera like the FX6 or the C70. But it's missing a lot of the more premium features that you find in a cinema camera because there's so much more that goes into a camera than just image quality, like autofocus, frame rates, stabilization, and design. For the next test, I wanted to see just how good the autofocus was, and I wanted to push it to its very limits. To be more specific, I stuck myself out of a moving car, which is super illegal, and shot a motorcycle stuntman. And you might notice most of this footage is way too shaky to be usable, but he's in focus. Okay, but in all seriousness, the autofocus in Sony cameras is amazing. What stands out for me is one specific thing, the face tracking and object tracking. The camera actually knows what it's looking at, a person, an animal, an object, even if it's a moving object like a car, and the autofocus just works. When using the A7S with a gimbal, I had zero problems keeping my subject matter in focus. I could start 30 feet away, go right up close, and everything would stay in focus throughout the entire movement. I also shot my friend, who's an amazing kickboxer. He was throwing fast punches left and right, the camera was whipping around, and despite all of the chaos, the autofocus was quick and accurate. If it ever lost focus, the recovery was very quick. So for me, this was really exciting, because I really wanted to shoot a lot of movement for the final project. And speaking of stabilization, I know the motorcycle footage from earlier looked like garbage, but that wasn't the camera's fault. It was my fault. Because using this camera is an absolute dream. I was able to get into really awkward low angles and get shots that almost look like I used a slider or stabilizer. And on top of that, it also has gyroscopic stabilization built right in. But there is a small catch. You have to use the Sony Catalyst software. Although it's free, I wish it was a plugin for Premiere Pro or Final Cut instead. Because otherwise, every time you want to stabilize a clip, you have to go into Catalyst Browse and stabilize it there and then re-import it back into your main project. It's a cool feature, but I don't think a lot of people will use it simply because it's tied to the Sony editor. It's unfortunate. But now for the ultimate test, shooting an actual project with this camera. A real world test, a real client, real consequences. So we're going to shoot an actual live music video. On the day of the shoot, we only had 3 hours to do everything, and I'll be honest, it was pretty chaotic. We were in a massive studio space, but with only 2 light panels, and these lights were absolute garbage. So it actually ended up being a low light shoot because I shot the entire day at 12,800 ISO. And I was super nervous because what if all the image came back grainy and noisy because of 12,800 ISO? But I was pretty shocked to see that pretty much all of it is super clean. You do lose a little bit of dynamic range, but overall, it looks just as good as 640 ISO. However, as I mentioned this earlier, I found constantly having to overexpose your camera by 2 stops for S-Log3, which gives you the most dynamic range, is kind of an annoyance. Instead of focusing on getting your image just right, you're constantly thinking about overexposing by 2 stops, and it's just a distraction from like the creative process. I actually recommend that most people shoot this camera on standard. You'll lose only a tiny bit of dynamic range, but for the most part, you're still going to get 10-bit color at 422 at a really high bit rates. But the one thing that did save the day with the A7S III was the fact that the autofocus is amazing. It's a super light camera that's really easy to balance. For most of the day, I was just flying around on the Ronin, trying to get as interesting of shots as I possibly could. The autofocus was honestly the hardest thing working on sets. Highly recommend it. And design-wise, I don't really have any problems with the ergonomics or menus of the A7S III. However, I want to let you guys know that there's also the FX3, which is the cinema version of the A7S III. It's pretty much the same camera, just in a more cinema-oriented body. It's missing an optical viewfinder, but has a better audio unit. All right, so at the end of the day, who's the A7S III really for, and should you get one? I tried to push this camera as hard as I possibly could, and it's a pretty unique offering. There's nothing else like this on the market right now. It has amazing low light, god-level autofocus, 4K at 120 without cropping, and it's super small, smaller than any of the Canon cameras. And the level of flexibility with color and exposure is pretty impressive. There's really nothing else like this on the market, although there is the Canon R5C, which has a 45 megapixel sensor. If you're someone that definitely needs a high resolution sensor for photos, that might be the camera for you. And that camera also has 8K video. I personally would rather go with the Sony camera because I want that extreme low light and I want that super fast autofocus. But if you're someone that definitely has to do photos and you need that high resolution, A7S III is probably not for you, and you might want to actually look at the R5C. If you guys want to see a video about the R5C up against the A7S III, let me know in the comments down below.